20. It felt good to move, to be doing something rather than standing around camp waiting. Evie had forgotten how much she enjoyed being planet-side. Her last significant trip down to a planet, apart from Sypaxia, was when her last assignment, the Saragossa, had stopped on S-Hook, a planet teeming with life. The S-Hook were conservative, and everything they built was designed to either have zero impact to the surrounding environment or enhance it in some way. She'd walked among their massive bamboo cities, which had been constructed above the plains on which they sat, suspended high above the trees and the animals that grazed there. The air had been fresh, and the stars' heat warm, and the music from the surrounding wildlife was like an injection of purity. All these creatures living in a harmony, cultivated and preserved by the S-Hook. She'd found it invigorating. Trudging through the woods sent a similar tingle through her skin. She enjoyed being outdoors, where the air currents could change, where the sights and smells never ceased, and where the sounds of wildlife carried on the air. There were no errant sounds on a starship, except for the occasional hum or clang of something going wrong, and the air was always sterile, unless someone happened to be burning incense or something more exotic. The decking was always sure underfoot, and no one ever had to worry about scratching themselves on a stray limb sticking out somewhere. For all the senses humans had, living on a starship was boring. This was much more refreshing. Humans weren't meant to be sealed up in tiny little ships, flying across the cosmos. They were meant to be part of an ecosystem, one determined by the random occurrences of a planet. It all made her miss Sisk. "Captain?" Uma whispered from somewhere behind her. Evie turned and trundled back to the group. She'd pulled ahead without realizing it. Her security chief was standing close to a series of plants they'd passed just a moment before, shining her light on their leaves. "What is it? Does this look like blood to you?" Uma held out the blue leaf with a dark crimson stain. Evie had to admit it looked like dried blood, but she couldn't be sure. She shone her light on the rest of the leaves. Only a few of them had the mark. She rubbed the leaf with her fingernail, and the crimson smeared off, having not completely dried in the humidity. "What are the odds the creatures on this planet bleed red?" Evie asked. Uma indicated to their left. More marks along the trunks of the trees, and even on the ground. Whatever had happened, it had left a trail. Evie didn't like the coincidence of this. According to River's calculations, they were less than a kilometer from the shuttle, or its approximate location. She'd said there could be a 3-kilometer variance in any direction, so the plan was to reach the center of her coordinates, then search outward in a circular pattern until they found it. She hoped this was a sign someone was out hunting for food, though there would have been no need to do so. The Honduras had been packed with supplies, enough to keep the small crew on the shuttle alive for weeks if left alone. "Captain?" Uma said, further concern in her voice. She and the others turned to look, as Uma had followed the trail further until she stopped. Evie came up behind her, gritting her teeth as she saw what Karen had found. On the ground was a human arm, still in the Coalition uniform, where it had been torn from its owner halfway through the bicep. Not at a joint like the shoulder or the elbow, but straight through the middle of one of the strongest muscles in the body, not to mention the bone. And it hadn't been cut either. From the white splintering, it had been broken and ripped off. "Can you tell who it is?" Evie asked. Uma shook her head. "Just that it's female. That leaves Volante and Benson, but I can't tell which one. They both had fair skin." She indicated the hand at the end of the arm. "Is there any way the crash could have done this?" Vostokov asked. It was hard to tell in the dim light, but she seemed unnerved. "I've never seen a shuttle crash do anything like this. Usually it's all or nothing," Uma said. "Wouldn't you agree, Captain?" Evie didn't bother responding. This wasn't the result of any kind of accident. She unholstered her weapon and activated it, noting the other 4 followed her lead. "The trail leads this way," Evie said, even though it was at a tangent to the destination River had programmed for her. We need to follow it and find out what happened." Her hope was either Volante or Benson had wandered away from the rest of them and run into a wild animal of sorts. And as gruesome as it was, that was the best-case scenario. As they tracked forward, Evie caught the scent of blood in the air. The coppery tang only grew stronger as they followed the splashes of blood along the ground around the limbs of trees. A distinct buzzing sound also caught her attention. It had been faint at first, but as they moved forward, it only grew louder. Evie pushed through the brush, only to stop dead in her tracks. Dozens of humongous insects, each the size of a human head, were hunched over, poking their bulbous eyes into a pile of something on the ground. The insects had segmented bodies, each with black and green markings and large wings on their backs, and at least a dozen tiny little legs underneath them, allowing them to crawl over each other and the pile. Their faces were made up of giant eyes, but below them was a long needle-like protrusion, which they stuck into the pile and into each other if they got too close. "I think I'm going to throw up," Carson said from behind her. Evie couldn't blame him. The writhing mass of bugs on top of each other, like a sick orgy, turned her stomach. Uma pointed her rifle at one and shot past it, kicking up dirt where the pulse impact hit the ground. The giant bugs scattered to the air, their buzzing intensifying as they retreated to the limbs of trees high above them. Evie watched them go, concerned they might drop back down on top of them. There was no telling how aggressive they were, or how long they would stay away from their feast. "Okay, now I am going to be sick," Carson said, running off to the side of the small clearing and retching into the bushes. Small black beetles scattered from underneath as he did. Evie followed one of them as it approached, then made a turn toward the pile the giant bugs had been feasting on. A pile of human parts. Legs, torsos, hands. They were all there in a small mound, all ripped from one another, and according to the torn and ripped uniform, all belonging to the same person. Something had torn her crew member apart, then piled them up like trash. "It's Benson," Uma said, stepping forward for a closer look. "She was the only lieutenant science officer on the shuttle." "No head?" Evie asked, not wanting to get any closer. As soon as the bugs had scattered, the smell broke free, and the entire area smelled like rot and decay. Uma nudged the pile with her toe. Another black beetle scattered out from underneath. "Not that I see." Evie scanned the trees with her rifle in front of her. Something had piled these parts of Benson back together. Whether that was the ritual of a local animal, or the result of a conscious choice, she wasn't sure. But she also wasn't taking any chances. "Everyone on high alert. I don't want—" A scream cut her off, and she turned in time to see Carson dragged backward into the darkness of the woods, his eyes wide with fear and his weapon on the ground where he'd dropped it. "Captain, help! Help!" His words were cut off by a sickening crunch. "What the fuck? What the fuck?" Williams yelled as he fired wildly into the woods where Carson had disappeared. "Everyone to cover," Evie said. "Don't let them—" Williams was jerked to the side, as if on an invisible string, and lost his balance, falling face first into what was left of Benson. He coughed and pushed himself off the pile, only for something too fast for Evie to see grab his leg and jerk him back into the darkness, screaming. He tried turning to fire, but whatever had taken him was too quick, and his screams were cut off as abruptly as Carson's had been. "Form up," Evie said, as Uma and Vostokov stood back to back. Evie joined them, so all three were facing outward, their backs to each other. "What the hell is it?" Uma asked. "I can't even see what's happening." Evie didn't have an answer. This had been a terrible idea. The shuttle crew was more than likely dead already, and they'd been assembled into small little piles all around this area. Evie also didn't like how Benson's head was missing. What could have wanted it? Were these the Andromeda aliens? And if so, was pure carnage all they cared about? She should have brought an army. "There," Uma said, firing off 3 pulse rounds in quick succession toward what Evie could see was nothing but a blur at the edge of the woods. The pulses disappeared into the night. "Damn! I've got it," Vostokov said, firing her own rifle 5 times in a row. One of the pulses sounded like it connected, but when Evie turned, there was nothing there. "I was sure I had—" Something struck Vostokov in the center of the chest, and she fell to her knees, dropping her weapon. She collapsed to her side, blood seeping from her chest, and her eyes devoid of any remaining life. "Captain?" Uma said, the tone and pitch of her voice rising. Evie dropped her gun, pulling her sword from its sheath and gripping it with both hands out in front of her. If she was going to die, she was going to die with her family's sword in her hand, not some coalition weapon. The glint of the steel reflected the woods all around them. "Are you crazy? If a pulse rifle can't hit it, you don't think a sword can?" "We're going to find out," Evie said, taking 2 steps away from Uma, her eyes scanning the woods. She wasn't going to lose any more crew members on this planet. The loss of the Honduras crew and her security detail was more than enough. It stopped now. Evie took a deep breath and saw the flash of movement in an instant. She drew the sword to the side, slicing what should have been the target, but meeting only thin air. She'd sworn she had whatever it was dead to rights. "Captain?" Evie turned to see Uma with a giant tear across her midsection, her intestines in the process of spilling out of her body. She collapsed to the ground, blood leaking from her lips. Evie forgot everything else, dropping the sword and catching her as she fell. Uma's warm blood coursed over Evie's arms as she helped her down to the ground. Whatever had hit her had torn away her uniform and most of her midsection, like taking the cover off a manifold. Everything inside was spilling out. "Karen, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," Evie said, holding her head, while Uma only looked at her with fearful eyes. "It's okay. You're not alone. It's okay." She didn't know what else to say, other than she was sorry for ever leaving the camp, for bringing them out here, and for putting them in this danger. And for one last second, Karen's fearful eyes turned accusatory before going blank as she shuddered her last breath. Evie looked up, expecting to see someone or something standing before her. But the woods were empty, and all she could hear were the sounds of the bugs buzzing high above her as the smell of fresh blood reached her nostrils. She lay Uma on the ground and closed her eyes, hating herself for what she'd just let her crew into. Maybe she deserved to die out here for this recklessness. Evie glanced over at the sword on the ground and didn't move to pick it up. Instead, she stayed on her knees, silently daring whatever was out there to come for her. Just when she thought it had decided she'd be the only one left to live, a grayish blur rushed her from the darkness, and she was gone. 21. Any exhaustion Cas had felt on the way to Wave 1's camp had been replaced by concern as soon as they'd arrived. But now, 10 kilometers back out from the camp, where there was nothing but endless jungle, his fatigue had crept back into his muscles, reminding him how far they'd traveled in only a few hours. If they ever got back to Tempest, he was going to need a few days in the cryo chamber because all his muscles were going to be too sore to move. They decided to move as silently as they could, not to attract whatever had attacked the camp. But Cas couldn't understand what had happened. No bodies, only a sign of struggle and some blood. And no box. Not even a trace of him. Which was the oddest part. Box might be a loudmouth, but he wasn't a coward. If the camp had come under attack, he would have been the first to help defend it. And perhaps the first to be taken away or disabled? Cas wasn't particularly sure he wanted to know what could take down a robot originally built for combat. "Hey," Jan whispered, coming up beside him. "How much further?" "Another 3 or 4 kilos. He looked to the sky, stuck in perpetual twilight. "I'd like to say we'd be there by nightfall, but it seems like we have nothing but time here." X came running up beside them. "There's something out there," he said. Cas stopped the line. "What?" "Something out in the woods. I heard it. Not far behind us." "Are you sure?" Jan peered around the rest of them, as did Cas, seeing nothing. Though anything beyond their current position was difficult to see in the low light, and their portable lights only did so much. "I swear it," he replied. He already had his weapon out and pointed behind them. Stillwater and Talia exchanged glances. If there was something out there, he wasn't going to be caught off guard. "Fan out," Cas said. "Take up defensive positions. Do not fire until you see the targets." Cas pulled out his boom cannon, switching it over to the projectile setting. He had no idea if pulse weapons would hurt whatever was out there, but based on what he'd seen at the camp, it hadn't been enough for Wave 1 to stop them. They each took position behind a group of nearby trees, all 5 of them with their weapons at the ready. Cas stayed in the center, with Jan and Stillwater on his right, Talia and X on his left. From somewhere behind them, the rustle of brush and leaves crinkled as something moved through the jungle. What little ambient sound had been around them fell silent, except for a croak from a nearby amphibious creature. The rustle grew louder, as if whatever was on their trail was slow but determined. X had been right, and from the amount of noise coming from that direction, Cas was surprised any of them could have missed it for very long. Whatever was approaching was big, determined, and relentless. As if it knew they'd stopped, the sounds grew louder and more frenzied, as whatever it was rushed to meet them, perhaps afraid they'd evaded it somehow. Cas realized he was looking right at it before he even saw the creature. Even though it moved, it had blended into the surrounding environment so well he hadn't realized it wasn't a shadow or a large bush. And as it poked its snout out, Cas heard Jan swear under her breath. The creature was huge, lumbering toward them on all 4s, and it had to be 2 meters tall, with long muscular legs covered in a deep brown fur. Based on its size, Cas estimated it weighed anywhere between 300 and 500 kilograms. Its muzzle was pointy, with a black nose on the end, and huge teeth when it opened its mouth as it sniffed. And its 2 black eyes bore no reflection of what little light remained. Its back coat was jet black, with a range of green and brown patterned in to help it disappear among the trees. And on its 4 feet were claws as long as Cas's hand. If they'd been on Earth, he would have called it a bear. But this was like a bear's great-great-granddaddy. It sniffed the air again, and reared up on its back legs, trying to catch their scent. It had to be 3, maybe 3.5 meters tall, standing, and it was all Cas could do to gape at it from around the tree. The bear caught the scent of something and fell back down to all 4s, approaching Jan's tree. Cas looked over, and she'd gone completely stiff. As much as he didn't want to, they would have to take down the bear, especially if it had been the cause of Wave 1's disappearance. The claws on this creature certainly could have made the marks on the shuttles back at the camp. Cas caught the eyes of the rest of his team and gave the signal to fire at will. X dropped out of cover onto one knee and shot the bear directly in the face. It grimaced, but didn't seem injured as it turned toward X and ran toward him, faster than Cas would have thought possible for such a large animal. The rest of them opened fire as the animal charged X, who swung back into cover, though it ended up not mattering. The bear charged into the tree he'd hidden behind, snapping it in half like it was nothing and grabbing X with his huge jaws, whipping him back and forth as the rest of them peppered him with their weapons. The pulse rifle seemed to do little to the massive creature, but Cas could see where his projectile setting was making dents in the bear's fur. They may not be penetrating the skin, but he could feel them hitting him. It just wasn't enough. After a few shakes, X was dead, and the bear dropped him, turning back to the source of his annoyance. "Shit," Jan said, and took off running. "No," Cas replied. "Don't run." The bear barreled past all of them, despite the gunfire. Its primary objective was Jan. It was so large and so fast, Cas couldn't see how she could hope to outrun it. But that probably wasn't why she ran. She hadn't been thinking clearly. As she turned to see the bear right on top of her with its jaws wide open, Cas almost couldn't watch. His weapon was having little to no effect, especially not on a predator full of adrenaline while it chased prey. There had to be something else he could do. Something shiny and gray came charging out of the jungle, slamming into the side of the bear and sending it reeling sideways as its body smashed through trees, cutting them right in half. "Box?" Cas asked, looking at the robot, who had seen better days. His frame was covered in claw marks and scratches, and one of his eyes had gone dark. "Took you long enough," Box replied. "Hang on, I gotta finish this." He dashed over to the bear where it lay, attempting to right itself after having been knocked 20 meters off the path. Jan stopped running to look back. The bear swiped at Box, but he knocked the paw away with a practiced move, and in one swift motion picked up the bear with both hands and threw it into the air. The bulbous black body of the creature made a long arc until finally it disappeared from view. Had he listened, he might have been able to hear the creature hit the ground. Box walked back over to him, dusting off his metal hands. "Doctor, pilot, animal wrangler, I do it all. Just call me Box, Renaissance man," he said proudly. "I thought you were dead," Cas replied. Box made a sound deep in his processor that sounded like an error message. "I thought you were dead. Where the hell have you been? We've been waiting on you forever." "We?" Cas asked. Jan and the others joined him, their weapons still out. "Yeah, we." Laura stepped out from the woods. She was followed by a couple dozen others, including Raffinkel, the crew of Wave 1. Cas approached her, trying to keep the confusion off his face. Her hair was much longer than it had been only a few hours ago, and he noticed a few of the other male crew members had beards, when they'd been clean-shaven upon leaving the ship. "What happened?" Cas asked. "We should ask you the same thing," Laura replied. In one hand she held her pulse pistol. It had seen some wear and tear, as part of the casing was missing, and it was dented and scratched. In her other she held a long stick that had been stained with paint and was sharpened to a point. "I don't understand," Cas said. "We were ahead of schedule. We lost contact with you in the upper atmosphere, and the captain ordered Wave 2 down. But we lost power as soon as we broke through the atmosphere. If it hadn't been for the space wings, we all would have crashed." "The same thing happened to us," Box replied. Getting a good look at Box, Cas noticed repairs that hadn't been there when he'd left Tempest. Someone had hammered a piece of his lower casing back into place with a crude tool. "Why?" Laura demanded. There was an edge to her voice Cas had never heard before, a no-nonsense brashness that he'd only ever seen hints of in her before. "Why what?" "Why did you wait so long before coming down?" she said, slamming the stick into the ground. Her eyes burned with intensity. "We didn't," Cas said. "We waited maybe an hour, 2 at most. Eve, the captain, was in a hurry to find out what happened to you, and our probes weren't working." "Sorry, boss. That just doesn't track," Box said. "Why not?" "Because we've been down here for a full season. Today is day 74. 22. When Evie awoke, it took her a moment to realize where she was. Not aboard Tempest in her comfortable bed. Instead, she found herself on a hard slab, while a magnetic field held her down. She thought she was back in sickbay with a restraining field binding her. But in the few milliseconds it took her to reach full consciousness, she dismissed that possibility. She was somewhere she'd never seen or been before. The slab was cold to the touch, as she could press her fingers to it, but not lift them back up again. Evie searched for any clue as to where she could be, finding only darkness around the well-lit slab. The light came from above, like sunlight through an open window somewhere far above her. The sides of the ceiling seemed to taper and form a 4-sided pyramid at the top, where the light source was concentrated. If she didn't know better, she would say it was this planet's star shining down on her, as the light was warm and radiant, unlike artificial light. Any other clue as to her whereabouts was beyond her ability to discern, and until she could find a way off this piece of rock, she might never learn the truth. Evie tried turning her head one way or the other, only to find it immobilized as well. although she thought she saw something move in her peripheral vision. She couldn't be sure, though. Without warning, the memories of what had happened in the jungle came rushing back to her, and she almost cried out. Watching Uma die in her arms with that accusatory look on her face was one of the worst things Evie had ever endured, though she deserved it. What if a similar foe attacked their camp at the same time, killing everyone there, and Cass's group as well? She might be the only person left on the planet. She only hoped Wave 3 had the good sense not to come down after them. But she couldn't panic. Not right now. She would save that for later. Everyone else might not be lost after all, and she needed to find a way out of here and back to them. She had to do everything in her power to make sure they were safe. She tried to speak, only to find her mouth immobile as well. Somehow she was able to breathe, but nothing else. Evie hummed to make sure her vocal cords still worked, which they did. Someone went to a lot of trouble to capture and keep her. But what did they want with her? And did she have any bargaining power? Or was all this nothing more than an elaborate show? Some sort of perverse torture in which the assailant makes you think you might have a chance to survive, only to end up cleaving you in half? Wait, no. Evie pressed her back against the slab, feeling nothing but the cold stone against her. No, she'd lost her sword. Either whoever had taken her had decided to leave it in the clearing with the body parts, or they'd taken it for themselves. Somehow that knowledge incensed her even more than losing her crew, and she struggled against whatever invisible force was holding her down. But as soon as she'd begun the struggling, she felt a pressure deep within herself, telling her to stop, that it was useless. Struggle would do nothing but waste energy. These weren't words spoken or relayed into her head like Sester might do, but more of an innate knowledge that had come to her from the ether. And the moment it did, she knew it to be true, and not part of some deception. She stopped. She drew the deepest breath she could manage and sighed, wishing whomever was out there would get on with it already. Waiting had never been one of Evie's strong suits, even as a little girl. And as soon as she thought of herself as a little girl, she was transported back to that place in her memories, remembering her time growing up in Sisk with her father. A hard time. But there were good parts, too. Like her friends Cassie and Runak. They had been inseparable, as three of the few non-Simulus children on the planet. But her thoughts didn't stay with Cassie and Runak. Instead, they went back to her father, though she tried not to think of him. She hadn't given him any considerable thought since the incident back in Sypaxia, and didn't want to start now. The memories seemed to have a mind of their own, and were shown to her as if on a vid screen. Evie sat on the floor of their modest home, playing with a homemade telescope, when her father stepped over her, asking her to be careful not to make a mess. She remembered this day, as she'd been so excited about the telescope, though now she paid more attention to her father, who, for the first time she could remember, seemed calm, genuine, and warm. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She watched him watch the younger version of herself from the doorway, a smile on his face. But was this what had happened? Evie couldn't recall, but she thought he'd gone off on his own to work on one of his projects or his paintings. He never paid her much attention when she was playing by herself. Did he? The memory dissolved into another. This one when she came home from school to show him her scores on the latest aptitude tests. She was 12, maybe 13. By then, she'd become numb to his indifference. She walked through the door, set her score pad on his desk, and retreated to her room. But the scene slowed, and though her younger self's back was turned, she saw the hint of a smirk on his face as he reviewed the scores until she was out of sight. Evie couldn't understand why she was remembering these events. She hadn't thought about them in years. And based on what she knew of memories, she couldn't see something she hadn't experienced. Even if these things did happen when she wasn't looking, it didn't mean they were real, or that they weren't part of some self-serving fantasy she'd made up to make herself feel better. She willed the memories away, but the scene changed before her again, and this time she was in a place much more recent. She was back on Cypaxia, standing behind her frail father as his hands flew over the painting with fury and determination. Evie tried to yell out no. She didn't want to experience this memory again, but it was like her brain couldn't help itself. He turned to her, but instead of the grizzled, hollowed-out old man she'd encountered, he was calm and composed. He held out his hands, inviting her in for a hug. No, this wasn't how it went. He'd accused her, cowered from her, then attacked her and called her a mistake. There was no happy reunion, no tearful apologies for years of indifference. It had been more of the same, and she could not forget. Suddenly, it seemed very important not to forget. She couldn't allow these thoughts to alter what she knew to be true, and she refused to be told what she'd seen and experienced wasn't real. Get out of my head! She closed her eyes, willing all her focus on the feelings of warmth and happiness toward her father. As she did, the image of them embracing in her mind cracked like a piece of glass, frozen on that moment. She focused harder, and the image shattered, revealing the true memory underneath, where he had pinned her down, spit flying from his mouth as he told her she had been unwanted and the cause of her mother's suicide. That was the real memory, and she wasn't about to let anyone overwrite it with something fake. She could only assume the other memories she'd seen were fake as well. Osborne had never touted her accomplishments, only tolerated them. He'd never shown her encouragement, only giving her things to keep her out of his hair and occupied. That was her truth. And whoever was trying to take it from her would not be successful. The extraneous feelings and images dissipated, and she had control over her mind again. If the creature who had captured her was part of Andromeda, why were they interested in changing her memories about her father? Perhaps it was part of a mental manipulation scheme designed to eventually get her to reveal secrets about the Coalition. And perhaps that was why she had been spared as well. They knew she was the highest-ranking officer and would have the highest clearance. If that was their plan, they were in for a rude surprise. She'd die before she gave up anything about the Coalition, regardless of whether she agreed with its tactics. She needed to keep her wits about her. If these aliens could manipulate memories, it was important she maintain her focus and hold true to what she knew was real. Evie couldn't allow them to tweak her thoughts to their own will, whatever their intentions. But even as she made the resolve, a feeling of intense guilt and melancholy came over her, while everything else fell away. All of this, everything until this point, was her fault. She had been the one who found Cas, without whom they never would have contacted the Sill. And without Zenfor's help, they never would have made it to Omicron Terminus in time. And the ship wouldn't have been disabled. Green wouldn't have died. And Tempest wouldn't be adrift at this moment, with most of its crew on the surface, more than likely dead. Had she never even left Sisk, things would have turned out very differently. Because after everything they'd done, it had all come to nothing. Her crew was dead, and she had been captured by some unknown entity. It had all been for nothing. She was going to die on this planet, just like everyone else around her. An image of Uma's accusatory face flashed in her mind again. She could see them all so clearly. Her crew sprawled out on the jungle floor, each eviscerated in a different and gruesome way. She was the only one left, and in her hand was her sword, the blade covered in blood. Despite the restraints, she screamed out in pain. Darkness came a second time. 23. "Don't you think it's strange the night is lasting so long?" Laura asked as Cas and the others continued walking. They decided to work this out on the way to the shuttle. Cas hadn't wanted to wait around for another one of those creatures, and he had a bad feeling about what might await them when they reached the Honduras. "Yeah, but a time distortion?" Cas asked. "Especially one so extreme? You're telling me 2 hours up there, He pointed above them, where Tempest was still orbiting, frozen in time. Is the equivalent to 73 days down here? He did a quick calculation in his head. So every hour up there is roughly 700 hours here. 730, Box amended, give or take a few minutes. Cas shook his head. Jan and the other members of his team trudged through the underbrush. They looked as bewildered as he was, though Raffinkel only scowled at the ground. She hadn't said a word since they had all come together, and Cas didn't want to know what 73 days in the underbrush had done to her mood. 73 days. It was hard to ignore the evidence. Laura's hair, Box's chassis in such poor condition, and it explained how the group had the time to disassemble one of the shuttles and rebuild it into a tower. "We thought you'd left us," Laura said, "and we had no way to get in contact with you. We didn't understand the time distortion until later. Once we started charting the star's progression across the sky, I realized it was the same track that we measured on the ship," Box said, "and I made the postulation that time works differently on this planet, extending out hours and days, so they last weeks or longer." "Is the time dilation constant?" Cas asked. Box nodded. "As constant as our own time. We've done a fair amount of exploration. It seems the same for the entire planet." Laura scoffed. "Yeah, that wasn't the smartest idea." When Cas raised an eyebrow to her, she capitulated. "We didn't know about the local wildlife when we landed. Those fuckers are big, but they're quiet. We lost 7 crewmen and one of our pilots to them before we even knew what they were." Cas glanced at Raffinkel, who didn't act as if she'd heard. "Which is what?" Jan asked from behind them. "I've classified them as a long-legged variation of Ursi, but with additional characteristics," Box said. "Fucking bears. I knew it," Jan muttered. Laura huffed. "They're impervious to weapons fire. They have very tough hides. You'll have also noticed they have opposable thumbs, making them especially dangerous. Though that seems to be a relatively new evolutionary feature in these creatures, as they haven't yet learned how to wipe their own asses or start wars with each other." Cas had missed the opposable thumbs. He'd been too preoccupied by the creature's huge mouth and claws. "So the only way you found to defeat them is to chuck them as far as you can?" Box switched into one of his accents. "Quite right. It's effective, isn't it? The old chap had no idea what was coming." He returned to his regular voice and leaned closer to Cas. "In truth, I like doing it. And as best as I can tell, it only stuns them. I've seen that monster before. He killed Jennings 2 weeks ago." "Any other apex predators I should know about?" Cas asked, pushing a piece of brush out of the way. "Nothing that bad. There are a few poisonous amphibians and some insects that are larger than what I'd like, but nothing like those beasts," Laura replied, keeping her eyes forward. "Why did you abandon camp?" Jan asked. "Once the bears learned it was a prime opportunity for feasting on squishy humans, we didn't have a choice. They were attacking constantly. By staying mobile, they have a harder time finding us. Occasionally, we'll go back for extra supplies," Laura said. "But we've lost so many people now, it's almost not worth it." "I didn't get a head count," Cas said. "How many are left?" 22, Laura replied, "counting me and Box. They've killed 18 of us so far." 18. At this rate, even if they got off the planet, they might not have enough people to run the ship anymore. They needed to hurry this up and get back to Wave 2's camp. Evie needed to know about the creatures and the threat they posed. "Have you found any way to kill them yet?" Laura shook her head. "Things on this planet are resilient." Cas couldn't believe it. Had he been alone, he might have sat down right there and given up. An impossibly strong enemy, no power, dwindling resources and personnel, and a ship they couldn't contact. If he could keep the feelings of hopelessness away, he might manage to keep putting one foot in front of the other. He turned to Jan, whose tense face stared right back. He'd never seen her like this before. She'd always been so reserved. But she was probably thinking the same thing he was. They were fucked. "Wait a second," Cas said. "So, If we've been down on this planet for 16 hours, that means only minutes have passed on Tempest. 1.2, Box replied. That's why they haven't sent Wave 3 yet. From their perspective, we've barely left. They won't be coming down for another 60 or 70 days. If they come at all, Jan said. I'm not sure I'd follow 2 waves down onto an unknown planet. Coming down here was stupid. Hey, Laura said, what else were you supposed to do? Suffocate? If we hadn't, all of us would be dead right now. Okay, look. We're not going to do this, Cas said. What's done is done and in the past. And unless I'm mistaken, we can't change that. We need to deal with what we have. We'll get to the Honduras, then get back to the captain and the rest of our people at the second camp. Then we'll take the next steps. Understood? He looked back at the group following along. Most were far enough away that they wouldn't hear them bickering. Or at least Cas hoped they wouldn't. Yeah, Laura replied. Jan remained silent. Are anyone else's olfactory receptors picking that up? Box asked. Cas sniffed the air. He didn't smell anything out of the ordinary. It smells like a surgical bay. A surgical bay? Cas asked. When's the last time you ran a diagnostic? Have you been experiencing any malfunctions? Box turned back to him, his one eye blinking. See this? He pointed to the dark eye. Does that look like it's designed to do that? Of course I'm experiencing malfunctions. I've been left out in the woods to fend for myself for an entire season. I'm not equipped to handle nature. He lifted one of his feet. Dirt caked the bottom of the metal sole. I've got dirt and grime everywhere. When we get back on the ship, you're going to need to do a full cleaning of all my systems. And I do mean a full cleaning. Oh no, Cas said. You're more than capable of that yourself. I've wasted too much time trying to get your shiny butt up to your impossible beauty standards. My body is a temple. It should be treated as such. Laura, tell him. Haven't I said he's on cleaning duty as soon as we get back? Laura sighed. See? She agrees, because it's important. Not all of us let ourselves go as we age. Cas swore under his breath. Maybe he hadn't been as concerned about Box as he'd initially thought. But as he breathed back in, he did taste the tang of something in the air that hadn't been there before. Wait a second, he sniffed. There was something wafting in their direction. Everyone hold back here. I need to check this out. He pulled his boom cannon from its holster and crouched, ignoring the fire in his loins. I'll accompany, Box whispered, in case you need me to throw another bear. Never did Cas expect to hear such a sentence uttered, so it was appropriate it came from Box. He pushed through more of the brush toward the smell, which was only growing stronger by the minute, and more pungent. He didn't like the implications of what that might mean, but he didn't stop. As he pushed through the underbrush, he found Ensign Rivers' coordinates had been close to accurate. The Honduras sat on the ground in front of him. The front of the shuttle was crushed, and he could already see blood on the inside of the shattered windscreen. Stepping quietly, he made his way around the shuttle to the back, where the hatch was open, and the source of the smell became evident. All around him were human body parts, piled into 4 groups. And as best he could tell, each one was a different crew member of the Honduras. Oh, that is gruesome. Box walked up to one of the piles, hunching down to examine it. This was Ensign Vellante, but she's missing her head. He picked up one of the dismembered legs on top of the pile. Don't touch that, Cas hissed. Box turned to him. Why not? It's not like we don't know it's a murder. And I've already identified the victim. I'm trying to determine what happened. Cas shot looks around the small clearing, searching for any further evidence of the bears. He didn't see the same signs he'd seen at Wave 1's camp, though. No claw marks on the shuttle, and the only spilled canister was empty. Whatever had been inside was long gone. He glanced up. Only a small opening in the trees marked where the shuttle had come down. But as best he could tell, it had landed nose first before the back end fell to the ground. Had anyone survived? Or had the bears just come through after, making their strange little piles? He caught sight of Jan standing at the edge of the trees where they'd come through. He motioned her over. "It looks like another bear attack," he said, indicating the pile Box hunched over. Laura came up behind them. "What the hell?" she asked. The other crew, including Talia and Stillwater, filtered through the trees, congregating at the shuttle. "The bear didn't do that." Laura indicated the pile of remains. "But," Cas said, turning back toward the pile, "I thought—" "The bears don't leave much. A splash of blood or maybe part of a uniform. Otherwise, it all gets eaten," Laura said. "We've seen it." "And it's not like a factory," Box added, still studying the pile. "It isn't like they shit them out like this. We also found their feces. And they're these giant black—" "Box," Cas hissed, "that's your fellow crewmate there." Box turned back to the pile. "Oh, sorry." He stood. "Definitely not the bear thing. Whatever did this can exert a lot of precision force. The parts weren't pulled apart at the joints. Instead, it seems Ensign Volante was brutally taken apart. From the constriction of the blood vessels, I would say it happened when she was alive." "God damn," Jan said. Cas nodded to the other piles. "The rest of the crew?" Box scanned them. "Crewman Stoyle, Crewman Corwin, and Ensign Willows." Box peered into the shuttle. "Looks like Ensign Theferi was piloting, but I don't see Benson anywhere." "Maybe she got lucky," Laura said. Her face was hard as stone, and Cas realized she'd experienced more death in the season she'd been down here than most officers saw in a lifetime. They all had. "Commander," Ensign Talia called, examining the ground close to the edge of the woods. "There's a trail here." Cas and Box walked over, with Laura trailing behind. Splashes of blood dotted the ground all around the area, like someone was running or had been dragged in this direction. "Oh," Box said, chipper. "Maybe the bear got her after all." They pushed through the brush, and Cas shone his light ahead of them, only to find another pile further away, just like the others. Or not. "Wait." Laura pushed past him. Cas ignored the slight and refocused his light on the pile while Laura ran over to it. "No." "What is it?" Cas asked. She stood and turned, her face a mess of emotions. In her hands lay Evie's sword. 24. Evie awoke with a start. She wasn't sure how long she'd been out, but the light above her head hadn't changed, leading her to believe either it was natural light, and she'd only been out a few seconds, or when the sun was up, it stayed up for a long time. This planet seemed to be in no big hurry to rotate. That was for damn sure. As best she could tell, nothing had changed. She still couldn't move beyond pressing herself to the stone slab, which had warmed. She was fed up. Were they planning on keeping her here until she withered and died under whatever this field was? Now she knew how Cas felt when he'd been restrained on the sill ship. "Let me out of here." She thought it with as much force as she could muster, realizing it was useless. And then she felt that weird pressure again. The pressure of a feeling that was hers and at the same time wasn't hers. Another memory surfaced. This one of when she was with Cas back in Jatan, hunting down Rasp. Only now she saw it from the outside. She and Cas hunkered down behind a barrier as Rasp fired at them from his own cover. The other Evie withdrew her sword, said something snappy to Cas, then moved with uncanny speed across the space between her and Rasp, dodging his blasts. She hadn't remembered moving that fast. But she crossed the distance in no time, knocking the weapon from Rasp's hands. Had that been how that had gone? She remembered going after Rasp, of course. But moving that fast? No human could move like that. It must be another deception from the alien. Another memory it was trying to alter for whatever reason. The scene shifted again to her and Cas standing outside the shuttle on Sypaxia. Again, Evie watched from above, as if she were a spirit on the wind watching herself. Her other self was agitated, which was understandable considering she'd just been attacked by Osborn. That Evie tried opening the door to the shuttle, only getting more frustrated as it didn't move. She yelled something, then slammed her hand into the side of the shuttle. When she pulled away, there was a considerable dent Evie hadn't noticed at the time. The shuttle was made from pure galvanium. There was no way that dent was from her hand. It had to have been there previously from when the shuttle flew too close to something. It wasn't possible. More lies. Nothing but lies, deceptions, and illusions. None of this was real. The scene transformed again, back to her and her father. Only this time it was shown as she remembered it. Him holding her down, screaming at her. But there was something different. It was almost as if she could move around the scene as it happened. And as difficult as it was to watch, this time she saw a spark of light inside Osborn's head, which had gone a strange kind of transparent. It flowed down and out of him into her other self's head, where it seemed to ignite something within her, as the spark lit many other sparks within the other Evie. The scene then transformed to Evie sitting at the helm on Tempest's bridge, piloting them through the maze of mines at Omicron Terminus. The map. The map in my mind. It had been how they'd made it out of there alive. But were the aliens saying her father gave her that ability? Or he somehow turned on something that already existed within her? Once again, the memory shifted. This time, the bridge transformed around Evie to when Diamant had them on the ropes. As she watched her and Vreej fight him off, she noticed that speed again. Diamant should have impaled her 100 times, but each time she managed to parry the attack, fending off his mandibles. And when the back of the bridge blew out, she managed to shove her sword right through industrial-grade deck plating and hold on while everything else was sucked out of the room. It only occurred to her now that she should have been sucked out along with everything else. The pull should have been too much. What did all this mean? That she was superhuman? If that was the case, then she should have been able to knock Osborn off when he pinned her. Unless she'd inherited her strength from him. She'd ignored the autopsy and results after he died, wanting nothing more to do with the man. What if something had been in there that would have given her a clue? It stepped into the light, just as the thought passed through her mind, startling her. Even though she'd seen one in her dreams, it hadn't quite prepared her for the real thing. Its skin was a mottled gray and completely hairless, though she could see veins underneath. Whatever it was, it pumped some kind of blood. Its head was leaner and longer than most other species, with the back of the cranium extending out an extra few centimeters beyond that of a human. Its black eyes were set higher on the face, and they were long as well, though she couldn't tell if it had eyelids, as it wasn't blinking. Both its nose and mouth were small. The creature stood taller than most humans, almost at Zenfor's height, but it was much slimmer. She bet it could outpace all land mammals. No wonder it had been so fast in the woods. It allowed her to stare and take it in, while it did the same to her. Finally, it reached up with one hand. Evie noticed 5 fingers on the end of the slender appendage, and tapped something beside Evie's head. She felt a rush of air as she managed to open her mouth and take in a deep breath of air. She'd been breathing through her nose this entire time. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want with me? Why are you showing me these things?" The alien only stared at her. She couldn't tell if it even understood what she was saying, or if she was nothing more than a curiosity to it. Whatever this thing wanted from her, she wouldn't submit. She would rather die than let them turn her mind against her, because she was sure that's what it was trying to do. For what purpose, she couldn't say. But she knew her memories, and those first ones had been fakes. The second set, she wasn't so sure. "Your word for us, Andromeda. It isn't accurate." His words startled her. Not because he'd spoken, but because of how normal his speech seemed. She'd half expected him to erupt into screeches and squawks. But she didn't need to respond yet. She needed as much information as possible. And if she looked desperate, then he might withhold everything. She could only assume he was even a he, as that's how his voice sounded. Though at the moment, she wasn't worried about the alien's gender. To ourselves, we are known as the Athru. Remember it. It will be important. Athru, she repeated, testing the word on her lips. What do you want with me? To give you truth. By changing my memories? Or trying to convince me what I know is a lie? How is that truth? The initial sequence was an attempt to ease your pain. It was rejected. The Athru walked around to the side of the slab. The scent of antiseptic filled her nostrils, though she couldn't tell if it was the creature or something else. The second sequence was the result. To give you the truth you deny yourself. He tapped the side of the slab again, and it was as if a weight was lifted off her. She could move freely again, and she sat up. What truth? Evie hopped off the slab. Her legs were sore, but they held. The truth that you are not of your world, that you should not exist. Evie's eyes narrowed. I've already been told that by one person, and he's dead now. Want to see if I can keep my record intact? You misunderstand, the creature said, his unblinking eyes staring at her. She saw now they weren't solid black, but instead a dark mirror. Her reflection stared back at her. I think I understand perfectly, she replied. We crashed your little party here on your weird world, and you don't want us finding something important. Something that might give us the ability to defeat you. That's why you killed the others. I killed the others because they were primitive and useless. You are not. And what makes me so special? Evie asked. The truth I'm not supposed to be here? Exactly, he replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You are not fully human. Instead, you are a hybrid of the Athru and humanity's primitive genes. She didn't react. That's what he wanted. A reaction, a rebuttal. Bullshit. As I've shown you, you have enhanced speed, strength, and mental abilities. But I still do not understand why you look fully human. Had I not felt your presence, you would have been slaughtered along with the rest of them. He walked out of the light again, but now that she was off the slab, Evie could see a row of flat stones beyond the edge of the light. The Athru touched one, and it glowed with runes and symbols Evie didn't recognize, though there was the image of a double helix rotating on the stone. Evie inched her way around the slab to examine it, but kept her distance. This looks like Durandar technology, she said. We don't associate with other species. It is our own. As she examined the double helix, she noticed it had a second set of connections running through it on its own smaller helix. Is this mine? It is. And I assume that's the Athru DNA? She pointed to the extra connections and smaller helix. It shouldn't be there, but yes. She eyed him. Why should I believe you? You killed my crew. Your people are on their way to my home to exterminate us. Why shouldn't I kill you where you stand? You don't have the means. Besides, you are a truth seeker. I was not expecting to find you, but here you are. Look at your own past. Is it so unbelievable? No mother, distant father. I have a mother, Evie said, anger bubbling up inside her. Your father told you a fabrication. Your mother was Athru, not human. It is the only explanation. Evie shook her head. So her mother hadn't committed suicide on the escape pod? What had happened?
Who is she? I don't know.
This is pointless, Evie said, her anger on full display now.
I don't care what you tell me or what evidence I'm presented with. You didn't spare me out of the goodness of your heart, if you even have one. Tell me what you want, and let's get it over with.
The Athru tapped the stone face again, and the images disappeared.
We do not kill our own. Thus you were spared. Just like that. And what about the rest of my crew? They will die, one way or the other, even those still in orbit.
Evie's eyes went wide. This place, whatever it was, had power. Was this what had kept their ships from using any energy? And could she turn the effect off? The only way to find out was to stay and try to get the Athru to tell her.
Your humanity is dumbing your otherwise keen mind. I can understand your thoughts without your permission. You can't deceive me. Any attempt to help your kind will only result in your restraint again. So that's it then, Evie said. I'm just supposed to stay here with you until when? Until the rest of my crew dies off from starvation?
She crossed her arms and leaned up against the stone table.
Either that, or I will exterminate them before we leave.
Leave, Evie said, nodding sarcastically.
Leave for where? We will join the others en route to your coalition. And there we will enact the final purge. Once the purge is completed, we can remake your coalition into the vast empire it is meant to be. One with a worthy species at its heart.
And you think I'll help you?
Why?
She asked, chuckling.
Believe me or not, but you will. And you will do it with pleasure. I guarantee it.
25.
She's dead,
Laura whispered, staring at the sword. She kept repeating the words over and over. Cas couldn't tell if the blade was covered in anything from this distance, but he didn't think it was. What the hell had you been doing out here?
I just found Lieutenant Uma,
Tilia said from behind him. Cas turned to see her standing a few meters away, beside another pile of body parts. As he walked closer, Uma's security chief insignia was unmistakable on what was left of her jacket.
Looks like the captain brought her team out here.
She pointed to 3 other piles close by. Cas shook his head. Are any of those her? Talia and Box went about inspecting the other piles. This one looks like Vostokov, Box said. She had a remarkable scar on the back of her hand. The others are male. None are the captain.
She's dead,
Laura kept repeating to herself, still gaping at Evie's sword in her hands. Cas indicated Jan go to her, tried to give her some comfort. Jan narrowed her eyes at him and shook her head. Cas sighed and went to her instead. Hey, he said. She might still be okay. She's not here. Laura stopped talking, but she wouldn't stop staring at the sword. Cas bent and picked up the sheath that lay on the ground beside their feet. He reached over and took the sword from her hands. He thought she might fight him for it, but she let it go without resistance. Cas sheathed the weapon, then handed it back to her. Hang on to it, okay? Laura looked up at him, her dark eyes staring into his.
What am I going to do?
Cas knew how she must be feeling. Losing someone you love was the hardest thing imaginable, especially if you never got to say goodbye. Cas knew all about that. And while this looked bad, Evie wasn't here. She might have gotten away. But more likely, she had been taken by whatever was making these piles. If she was still out there, they needed to find her. Cas glanced over to the pile that used to be Lieutenant Uma. This was becoming untenable. If they didn't do something soon, there wouldn't be a crew left to protect. Lieutenant, he said to Laura, her blank face staring off into the distance. Lieutenant! She snapped to attention. Take the rest of the crew back to our camp. I need to find out what happened to the captain.
If you're going off to find her, I'm coming with you, Laura said.
I don't think you're in the right emotional... Her glare stopped him from saying anything further. Instead, he turned to Box. Get over here. I need to see something.
How are you going to track the captain?
Box walked over. Cas put his weapon away and tapped Box's midsection twice, opening a port on his right side under his arm. Oi! What's this violation now? He said in his Cockney voice. I'm assuming you didn't experience a power failure like the shuttles when they went down. Cas studied the internal circuits he'd exposed.
Ah, the days of my youth, before this broken body failed me. When I get back to the ship, I'm giving myself a full overhaul package. I want gold-plated connections, not those cheap silver ones you installed, and a new breastplate. I think it should be something befitting an intergalactic hero. Maybe with a purple... Ow!
Hold still. Cas pulled a cord of wires to the side. Access your internal mapping systems.
Access my what?
What are you doing down there? Box bent to try and see under his armpit.
Go any deeper, and I'm going to expect you down on one knee with a ring in your hand.
Jesus, Cas whispered. Have you accessed the system?
Yes, husband-to-be.
Can you detect an errant energy signal?
No.
He turned to Jan.
Will you walk me down the aisle? He can't do it, as he'll be occupied, he said, indicating Cas. Is it incest if your brother marries you? I'm still not clear on...
Box, shut up for a minute, Cas snapped. Some of his connections had burned out. He was right. He did need better plating. But there was a workaround. All Cas had to do was attune his remaining receptors and connect them to Box's mapping system, if they would still connect.
He gets grumpy when he's under pressure, Box whispered to Jan.
There, Cas said. Reboot the system. Tell me if you see anything. A small click sounded somewhere within Box's metal frame.
I'm picking up two different signals. I believe one is the electromagnetic radiation from Ensign River's prosthesis.
And the other? Cas asked.
Unknown.
Perfect. He closed the port, stepping back. Whatever is keeping our systems from working is emanating a dampening field. My bet is that signal is the source of that field. I'm also betting if the captain is still alive, that's where she is. How far away?
6 kilometers due northwest.
Cas's legs rebelled at the prospect, but they didn't have a choice. If there was a chance Evie was still alive, they had to try and find her. And if they didn't shut off that field, they'd never be able to leave this planet. Okay, then. Box and I will go after the captain. I want everyone else headed back to camp. Hopefully, the bear things haven't found them yet. He turned to Laura. I need you to prepare them for what's to come. Lieutenant Zoll is in a bad way, and if they need to move him, they'll need ample time.
You must not have heard me. I'm going with you, Laura said. I'm not about to leave her to whatever the hell is out here ripping people apart and placing them in piles.
I'm going too, Jan said, her weapon slung over her shoulders, making it clear there would be no more discussion on the subject. What is the point of being first officer if no one will listen to me? Cas said. Jan only shrugged. Fine. He glanced at Raffinkel, who he normally would have put in charge, as she was the highest-ranked non-com. But she only stared off into the jungle, not paying attention to anyone. She'd been quiet this entire time. Instead, Cas turned to Talia. You're in command until you return to camp. Get these people back safely. Use what they've learned to avoid the bears. He handed her the tracker River had given him. This will get you there.
I won't let you down, sir, she replied.
Cas didn't question her resolve. Anyone who had been a victim of the Sargant trafficking ring was bound to be hard as iron. She had been right. The tattoo on her head served to remind not only her, but everyone else, that she was tough as nails and could get through anything. He had no hesitation about leaving the rest of the crew in her hands, despite Raffinkel and the remaining pilots' technically higher ranks.
What do we do about these?
Jan asked, indicating the piles of remains.
We can't just leave them like this.
I don't see we have another choice. We don't have time to bury them. He hated to say it. So many of the crew hadn't gotten their proper send-off, and it was a disgrace to leave them like this, piled up like trash. Maybe once they'd found the captain and had power back, or at least something that could repel those bears, they could think about rights. But they didn't even know who made these piles, and their ominous nature wasn't giving Cas the warm and fuzzies. Jan nodded. She knew as well as he did they couldn't do anything for them. Cas's eyes lingered on what remained of Uma. Why had they come out here? What had been Evie's thinking? She had known he and the rest of the team were planning on circling back around to the shuttle, but maybe they'd taken too long? Ensign, take what supplies you can carry from the Honduras and get moving. Even if time is stretched out here, it's only going to get darker, and you've got a long hike back to camp. Talia nodded and issued orders for the rest of the crew to begin parceling out what they could carry from the Honduras, while also telling them to rest and refuel while they had a moment. Cas glanced to Box. Are you ready? Oh, you assume I'm coming? After that blatant violation of my personal space? I figured you'd want in on the action, Cas said. You are the hero, after all. Now you're just mocking me, Box replied. You're right. I am the hero, and I'll be the one to lead us to victory. He turned to Cas. How did you know how to set my scanning system to pick up the signal? There's a lot of things about your internal processes you don't know about. Over the years, I've had to disable a lot of them for your own good. You have not. Cas rolled his eyes. I had to. Whoever set your original programming didn't do a great job of making sure you were stable. Turn them back on right now, Box said. Cas thought he heard anger in his voice. Box, they were all military applications, and they were screwing with your programming. I shut them off for a reason. Then why don't I remember any of it? He put his metal hands on his hips. Cas noticed he stood at a slight crook that hadn't been there before, possibly due to a fight with one of the bears. Trust me, if you knew what you were like in those early days, you wouldn't blame me. You weren't very pleasant. And he is now? Jan asked. Trust me, Cas replied. It was a lot worse. When this is over, Box said, we need to have a very serious discussion about my personal autonomy. Fine, but now we need to go. Is everyone else ready? Laura only stared out into the woods, her hand on the strap holding the sword across her chest. We don't have time to stand around here and chat, she said. I'm ready when you are, Jan said. Then let's move. Cas stared at Box, who only stared back. Well? I'm deciding whether or not to incapacitate you. Box, we need to go. Where's the signal coming from? He held up a finger. Still deciding. We don't have time for this, Laura said, pushing past the two of them and heading for the woods. Lieutenant, that's not the way, Box said. Then stop fucking around and tell me where to go. The woman I love could be dying right now, and you're stuck here worried about your stupid pride. Box hung his head for a moment. I apologize. It's this way. He began walking along the side of the shuttle, then into the woods. Laura followed right behind. I think she hurt his feelings, Jan said, coming up beside Cas. He'll get over it. Cas hoped it might help Box forget to ask about his former programming. But then again, he'd never had that kind of luck. 26. Evie wasn't sure how to process what she'd heard. This creature, a member of a species determined to destroy her people and their way of life, thought she would help them in their goal? How deluded must he be? She stared at him from the other side of the table. As long as the stone slab was between them, she felt like she had at least a bit of control over the situation. Why do you want to destroy us? What did we ever do to you? We've never even encountered your species before, she asked. You have, but you wouldn't remember. No one would remember, the Athru said.
Why did you destroy the Bulak homeworld? What do you want with Earth?"
The creature laughed. It was a low-pitched haunting sound, which wasn't appealing at all.
"You are so naive. If you want the answers to your questions, you must be willing to surrender your mind."
"What does that mean?" Evie asked, trying to run through her options. She didn't see any doors anywhere. With her luck, the only way out was the giant skylight above them. One of the walls probably disappeared as soon as he placed his hand to it or something. She could try and incapacitate or kill him, but she might also strand herself, if that was the case. What if there were 100 more right on the other side of the walls, just like in her dream?
"You don't have the physical strength to incapacitate me. Your bones are weaker, your muscles smaller. Your senses are dulled compared to mine. There is nothing about you that's superior." "I'm captain of a starship. That's enough," Evie said.
The Athru shook his head.
"No, it isn't. You must be willing to surrender your very self if you want to understand your own nature. There is a part of yourself you don't even know, the Athru part. If you surrender to it, all will become clear."
"And if I do, what then?" she asked. She wasn't even sure how to do what he was asking, and she'd already eliminated the possibility of faking it. He would know, or at least he would pretend to know. But she had no clue what surrendering herself meant. She still wasn't sure she believed she was part Athru herself, and she couldn't even trust her own memories.
"All your questions will disappear, and you will understand your purpose. Once you surrender, I will answer those that remain, though most will be self-evident."
Evie didn't like the sound of that. She thought back to when she saw that map through the minds in her head. That had come from somewhere, and at the time she hadn't cared where. She also hadn't been able to trust herself not to hallucinate. Had all of that been part of her other self? Perhaps if she concentrated on it. But then what would happen to her mind now? There was no way to know, and her friend over there wasn't about to give her any help. All she could do was trust she was strong enough to handle it, whatever it was.
"Okay," she said, standing straight. "If those are your conditions, then I agree. Maybe once I understand, we can come to some sort of agreement." "Unlikely. When you are done, I will speak to you again."
He backed into the shadows.
"Wait, aren't you going to tell me what to do?"
Evie asked. How was she supposed to know if it had worked or not? She walked around the stone slab, then stopped. She was in his place, his rules. Without some kind of map, she wouldn't be able to figure a way out of here. And she bet all those stone interfaces were key to his genetic signature only. She thought back to Omicron Terminus again. That was the only connection she had to whatever this was. She focused on how she felt when the map flooded her brain, as well as how she felt when she experienced the hallucinations, though she couldn't remember what half of them had been. The more she focused on those moments, the more she felt something pulling at the edges of her mind. It was as if she were on a giant tarp pulled taut. Something clawed at the edges, causing the tarp, with Evie in the middle, to sink. Evie closed her eyes and focused on this manifestation, not knowing if it was another hallucination or not. But she could now see herself clearly on the tarp. As it sank further, the claw of a hand appeared at one edge, tearing into the tarp's restraints. The claw was gnarled and ugly, with sharp nails like knives at the end of it. But there was also something familiar about the hand. A second hand appeared, also clawing its way forward as the tarp continued to sink further. Then, at the edge, where the tarp dropped off into nothing, the owner of those claws appeared. Its dark brown hair a matted and dirty mess. Evie gasped as she saw the creature appear. It was her, but monstrous. Her eyes were black mirrors, and her mouth was 4 times too large, stuck in an open position, rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth filling its mouth, Finally, it said in her mind.
No, Evie yelled. I've changed my mind. You can't have control. It's too late.
The creature's thin, bony leg, with claws on the end of its foot, appeared over the edge, pushing the Evie creature to its full height. She was naked, her emaciated form warped and bent at odd angles. Her arms were twice as long as her legs, almost to the point where they dragged on the ground, and her tiny ribs were clearly visible through the skin. Her head was twice as large as it should have been for a body of such a size, and its wicked grin never left Evie's eyes.
You're mine now. No,
Evie yelled again, as the tarp sank lower and lower, encasing her in a cocoon. She couldn't squirm or move at all as the tarp constricted her form, pinning her arms to her sides. She continued further and further down until she was staring up at the monster creature, laughing as it waved its hideous hand. Evie was lost. Her eyes snapped open again. She stood on the far side of the stone table. A cipher, her people called it. She looked at her hands, each of them grotesquely human, with manicured nails. She hated them already, and she'd barely been aware for more than 5 seconds.
Welcome to the world, sister,
her compatriot said. She turned to him.
Your name is Rockron.
Yes.
And I have no name. I am the bastard child of Esturva and Osborne.
The names were ingrained in her mind, as if she'd always known them.
Esturva,
Rockron said.
Then she is the traitor. Once our mission is complete, we will find and punish her.
He turned to one of his terminals, placing his hand on the surface.
The other one, Evelyn, she will not return, she said. She is much too weak.
I am glad to hear it, Rockron replied.
In honor of your new life as an Athru, choose your moniker.
He held out his hands to her. She walked around the slab, taking his hands in her wretched human ones.
I choose the name Dagnya. Evelyn is such a weak name. Fitting for a human, but not for me.
Ah, Rockron said. Appropriate, I think.
Now, you have questions.
Dagnya thought about it a moment.
Not as many as she did, as you predicted. I thought I'd never see the light of day, trapped for 31 of their years, until he cracked the egg, the despicable father. How could a human possess such an ability?
Rockron narrowed his eyes.
I don't know. It shouldn't have been possible. But when he attacked her, it did something. We need not dwell on it. Now we must prepare. For the human's extinction, yes. I only regret that I'm stuck in this form.
He turned from her.
Not forever. You are a special case, after all.
Dagnya winced.
I can still feel her in the depths. She's fighting.
Upon seeing Rockron's concern, she continued.
But she won't return. Her mental facilities are much too weak. It is more of an annoyance than anything else. Good. I tried coaxing your presence from her, but she had enough control to keep you suppressed until actively releasing you. I would hate for her to find a way to trap you again.
Dagnya shook her head.
It won't be an issue. Tell me everything about my people. There is only so much I know from her memories. You have an innate hatred of the humans. This is natural for the Athru, and we are finally mobilizing on the great plan. It has been millions of years in the making. After millennia of searching, we have found their homeworld, the planet they call Earth. They have the audacity,
Dagnya scoffed.
I assume the information in my mind is accurate. Instinct coded within your very genes,
Rockron replied, moving over to the stone controls. He placed his hand upon them, and they lit up, glowing a bright blue with Athru script. Dagnya had no trouble reading it.
This world, it is our staging ground, our weapon against the humans. The thing that has made all our efforts possible, Rockron said. I was left behind to guard the structures, but imagine my surprise to find a human ship in orbit. And the fools came down on their own. They were in distress, Dagnia replied. It was damaged. It matters not.
Rockron touched the stone again. An image of the Tempest came up, still in orbit.
Their temporal signature is still within that of the rest of the universe. Mere minutes have passed on board since our crew arrived. Ah, the temporal distortion. The human was too stupid to figure it out. Being on this planet gives us an unlimited amount of time.
She glanced down at her body.
But this body is frail. It will expire within another 60 or 70 years. Do not worry, sister.
Rockron tapped her shoulder.
We can move you from it. It already has the base genetic markers. What is most important is the mind. Now that you are your true self, that is all that matters.
He turned back to the stone.
The humans are helpless without their technology, to which I have eliminated access. And with nowhere to go and no way to defend themselves, we will manage to kill them all in a short amount of time. Then we can rejoin the others. It won't be long before they reach the humans' precious coalition. What of the other species? The Utubru, the Yaxinax, the Claxians?
Dagnia asked.
They do not deserve our wrath. No, they have done nothing wrong. The collective agreed they will be spared as much as possible. We hope to form an alliance with all of them once the humans are extinct. Essentially, we will take their place. The humans deserve nothing less. Tell me, Rockron said. You have access to her thoughts. How did a human ship end up out here? Even if they did detect us, they shouldn't have had the technology to come this far, this fast.
Dagnia sneered.
They allied with the Sill. It was their technology which allowed the humans to traverse the distance.
Rockron frowned.
The Sill may think we are coming after them. We'll have to make it clear that is not the plan. Perhaps they will abandon their human allies. Do you expect the Sill will retaliate? She has seen their technology. They are formidable. I'm surprised they were willing to help such an inferior species as it was. They may be advanced, but I must take some time to catch you up on our technology. 31 years for you was over 20,000 for us. Improvements were made. The Starkiller,
Dagnia smiled.
Our greatest achievement. Of course we can't use it on the humans' home star, not unless we want to destroy the Claxians as well. What do they call it?
Dagnia searched the human's memories. The word was on the tip of her thick and wet tongue. She only had to remember.
Horus. But I don't know what it means.
Rockron laughed.
The arrogance. They named it after the Egyptian god of the sky. I'm surprised they just didn't call it the sun.
Dagnia cocked her head.
Why would they call it sun? You need a refresher on human history, Rockron replied, motioning to the stone info tablets. Come, let's catch you up. We have the time.
27. I'm surprised the bears didn't convince you to return to the camp, Cas said, as they made their way through the jungle behind Box.
Who are the bears more likely to go for? The 3 tiny morsels of food or the giant buffet?
Jan said.
I believe in making myself as small of a target as possible.
That's a good plan, he replied, until we run into one of them. Let's hope you can run really fast.
I only need to be faster than you, she winked.
I sense the early stages of a budding attraction between you and Captain Jan, Box called, loud enough for everyone to hear. Heat rose in Cas's cheeks. He couldn't even look Jan in the eye. Is that a correct assumption, or are my parameters off? Cas grumbled something incoherent. keeping his eyes down. "Is that a yes? Or are you still unsure if your playful banter is having the desired effect?" Box called again. "I think maybe you have a few diodes loose. Let me take a look at those for you," Cas said through gritted teeth. The jungle had become unbearable, and Cas pulled his collar loose to give himself some more air. He was going to kill Box. "It wouldn't be the first time," the robot replied. So that was it. He was mad about Cas modifying his programming. Fine. Cas could deal with that. He chanced to glance to Jan, whose own eyes were forward, as if nothing had been said. "How much farther?" Cas glanced over his shoulder at Laura. Her face was a mix of emotions: pain, determination, fear. But he could tell she wouldn't stop until they found Evie, or what was left of her. "Another 200 meters, Box replied. "But I believe the signal may be subterranean. From our approach, it seems to be embedded beneath the surface." "Tunnels," Laura said from behind him. "Either that, or we're going to have to dig for the thing," Cas replied. "But He ran into the back of Box, who had stopped just before a small clearing. "Ow! What the hell?" "Look," Box pointed. There stood a stone arch 3 meters high. It looked ancient, as if the sands of time had worn it down over eons. But it wasn't the first time Cas had seen the arch. He turned to Jan, who nodded. "What?" Laura asked. "It's an artifact from a dead civilization. So what?" "You don't understand," Jan replied. "This is an exact copy of the arch we saw in space. The one the captain saw and that we passed through. And on the other side was the Andromeda ship that came after us." Cas examined it. Beyond the opening was nothing but more jungle. But based on his experience, it was an illusion. There could be an entire army of the aliens on the other side of the arch. Maybe he should have told the crew to come with him after all. He picked up a stick and tossed it into the opening where it disappeared. It hadn't come through on the other side. "Damn," he said, pulling his boom cannon back out and unlocking the safety. "Do we go through?" Laura asked. "Is that where the signal is coming from?" "As far as I can tell," Box replied. "But if this is like the other arch you encountered, should I even be able to detect the signal?" Cas screwed up his features. He was right. The purpose of the last arch had been to conceal a warship within a time bubble. But they were already in a time distortion here on the planet. Maybe this arch had another purpose. Maybe it concealed something, but in a different way. "Walk around it," Cas said. "See what happens to the signal." Box strode around the arch to where they could see him through the other side. "It's behind me now." "Then it's definitely in there," Laura said. "Yeah, but we can't just go barreling through. Who knows what's on the other side? And without reconnaissance, I'm hesitant about sending—" "Screw that. I'm going." Laura pushed past him. He hooked his hand on her arm, stopping her. "Not until we know it's safe." She wrested her arm from him, her eyes sharp and cold. "Don't tell me not to go after her, because to stop me, you're going to have to pull a court-martial." "Did someone call me?" Cas spun in place, his weapon locked on the owner of that voice. At first he hadn't recognized it. All he knew was a voice had come from somewhere behind him. Marshall stood at the edge of the trees, his hands up. "About time you got here. I was worried." Cas didn't drop his gun. What was Marshall doing here? And how had he found this place? "Aren't you a little far from camp?" Cas asked. He glanced over to Jan, who had also trained her weapon on the bartender. "Do you want to save the captain or not?" Marshall replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Wait," Laura said, stepping in between Cas and Marshall. "What do you mean? You know where she is?" "I know she's in there." He indicated the arch. "And we don't have a lot of time. It might be too late already." "Too late for what?" Cas asked. Nothing about this was right. Marshall dropped his hands. "Look, I messed up, all right. She left the camp when I wasn't paying attention. Or she knew I was watching her and snuck out on purpose. Once I realized she was gone, I tracked her to the shuttle. But she wasn't there. This was the only other place they could have taken her. Who? Cas asked, reasserting his weapon. You better start explaining right now. Please, Marshall said with a wave of his hand. You have nothing to fear from me. If I'd wanted to hurt you, I had plenty of opportunity during your many visits to my establishment. I think he means he could have poisoned you at any time, Box said, leaning over. My only concern is the safety of the captain, Marshall said, but I can't do it alone. Cas turned to Box and Jan. What do you think? I think it's an awful big coincidence, Jan replied. I think it's a stroke of good luck, Box said, chipper. Marshall was always the one to call me when you overdid it. I don't believe he wishes you ill will. Cas worked his jaw, then dropped his weapon. Explain. Now. I can't, Marshall replied. I made an oath. Just trust I know what I'm talking about, and we need to hurry. You know what this is? Cas pointed to the arch. Despite not seeing the last one? I'm familiar with it, yes, he replied. What is it? A temporal gateway. It is used to envelop a location from the effects of the passage of time. The result is, a person could stay within one forever and never age. One could watch the progression of the universe unfold before their eyes. Time doesn't pass inside? Cas asked, eyeing the gateway. Marshall came up beside him. It doesn't pass in the same way. It doesn't track with the rest of the known universe. How does it work? It's too complex to explain. Now that is convenient, Jan muttered. Laura pushed her way past all of them. I'm done with this. Evie needs help. Before Cas could reach for her again, she disappeared through the arch. Shit, Cas said, pointing his weapon forward and following her. He prayed there wasn't an army of aliens on the other side. Evie's description of her vision shot through his head. All those creatures standing before her. How did he know that wasn't what awaited them on the other side of this door? As he passed under the arch, there was a shimmer, and he emerged into a large clearing. Before him, the ground sloped down. But he had to put his hand to his eyes because the sun was blinding. What the hell? I told you, pocket of time, Marshall said from behind him. The rest of them had followed through the arch. This pocket is in perpetual daylight. Cas blinked a few times before his vision adjusted, and he saw Laura trotting down the slope. In front of them stood a massive four-sided pyramid, with large columns at each corner. About halfway up the pyramid was a thick outcrop that circled around all sides, and the very top of the structure was flat, as if the point had been cut off. Is that a smaller version of the one we saw at Omicron Terminus? Jan replied. Structure is the same, though. We need to catch up with the lieutenant, Marshall said, jogging after Laura. Jan followed. Can you believe this? Cas asked, as he and Box brought up the rear. It reminds me of this drama I saw once, Box said. Well, not so much a drama as it was an erotic adventure. You mean a porno? Cas shook his head. I mean research. It was about this princess who ruled in a pyramid much like this one, but she had too many suitors who wanted to sire her heir. She had to test each of them out. It was very informative. Cas made a face. How is that research? What the hell are you doing at sickbay all day anyway? That's my business. Zach said I could run my experiments, thank you very much. And now that I've got your sample, I'll finally begin my final phase. Cas stopped him. Don't use my sperm for anything weird. The only reason you got that was because you saved my life. If we get back to the ship and I find some weird-ass clone hybrid, I'm not going to be happy. I'm insulted, Box said, feigning shock. You think I would do anything weird? Don't you know me at all? Yeah, Cas replied, jogging again to catch up. I know you too well. They reached Marshall and the others, standing beside a small outcropping at the base of the pyramid. It was solid stone. How do you get into the stupid thing? Laura asked, running her hands over the smooth stone. Here. Marshall placed his hand on the side of the stone. It glowed blue, then dissolved away, just like the doorway had on the warship they'd boarded back at Omicron. Cas turned to him. Who are you? His gray eyes found Cas. I'm your friend, and I'm sworn to protect the captain. That's my only goal here. Cas stared into the dark hall beyond the doorway. They'd need their flashlights once inside. This was crazy. Could he trust Marshall not to lead them into a trap? Who was to say this wasn't how the captain was captured? But Marshall had been on the ship since before Cas had arrived. And yet he knew something about these aliens. He had access to them. You son of a bitch, he said. You've known about these things this entire time, and you did nothing to warn us. That's not how it happened, Marshall replied. It was my honest hope they would never target the Coalition. But they did, and here we are. Cas got in his face. You could have given us intel instead of sitting down at that bar. We could have been prepared for the mines. He shoved Marshall. We could have prevented dozens of casualties. Green would still be here, and we wouldn't be stuck on this planet. He lunged for Marshall again, but Jan and Box grabbed him from behind, pulling him back. I swear to you, that's not how it is. I will explain myself, but we must go. It will take some time to reach her. His eyes pleaded with Cas. He wanted to tie the man down and interrogate him, ask him why the hell he waited until just now to tell them he knew something about Andromeda. Box, where's the signal? Cas asked, even as they continued to hold him back. All indications say it is somewhere inside. It's the control center, Marshall said. We'll be able to turn off the dampener, keeping the power off back at camp. It's designed for defense, to prevent planetary invasions. Cas gritted his teeth again. How do you know so much? Boss? Box asked. What? Cas jerked his head to look at the robot. The lieutenant. Cas turned back to the pyramid's opening. Laura was gone. 28. Sachs had to admit it. Despite her initial diagnosis, Zoll had lasted longer than she had expected. Perhaps that was because Sachs always prepared for the worst-case scenario. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Wasn't that what the humans said? And Zoll had managed to hang in there, despite the oxygen poisoning running through his organic body. She'd performed as many repairs as possible to his exoskeleton. Thank goodness she'd begun studying robotics for Box's sake. But there was only so much she could do without power. If the shuttle was working, she could deoxygenate him. But all she had was the equivalent of pain medications. Zach stood, stretching the vertebrae along her spine. She'd need some extra R&R after all this was over. She wished Carson hadn't gone with the captain. He could have relieved her for a few hours. Stepping out into the muggy evening, she stared up at the sky. As best she could tell, it hadn't gotten any darker since they'd arrived, which was kind of perfect. It reminded her of home, where people would stay on the dark side of the planet for weeks at a time, communing. She always said the best time to study was at night, under the stars, as they kept watch over you. And while it was still just too light to see many of them, their constant presence up there was a comfort. She could almost feel the outdoor library around her now, though it was a lot muggier here. "Doctor?" Ensign Fortune yelled, motioning her over. As she ran to him, she lifted up the hem of her long dress that normally skirted the ground, but here did nothing but collect dirt. "What is it?" she asked. "Movement." Fortune indicated to the woods beyond. From the edge appeared a face Zax hadn't seen since before leaving Tempest. "Riley!" She ran over to meet him. "You're okay." He looked at her with haggard eyes, and he'd somehow grown a full beard in the few hours since she'd seen him last. "What happened?" As if to answer, more of the crew from Wave 1 came pushing through the trees, all of them looking exhausted.
"It's been a while, Doc. How are you?"
Riley asked.
"I don't understand," Zax replied. "What's going on?"
"Fucking time travel, that's what." Zax turned to see Ensign Talia come out of the woods with everyone else, including the Space Wing pilots from Wave 1.
"I'm sorry?"
Zax wasn't sure she'd heard her right.
"Time's all screwy on this planet," Talia replied. "In the 2 hours between when Wave 1 and Wave 2 came down, about 70 days passed. Or that's what they're telling us anyway."
Zax turned to Riley.
70 days?
73, actually. More than a season. Zax surveyed the groups of people emerging, reuniting with their fellow crewmates.
"Is this all that's left?"
"It's been a rough time," Riley replied.
"I did the best I could, but when people survived the attacks, it usually wasn't for long."
Zax's expression softened at her nurse's words. She knew he'd done his best.
"What kind of attacks?"
"Animal. There are bear things out there. And believe me when I tell you they're lethal." She rubbed his arm with one of her upper hands.
"Go, find somewhere to rest. I've got Zol in that shuttle over there. There's a few extra bunks. I'll bring you some provisions in a few minutes."
He nodded appreciatively and headed off for the shuttle. She turned back to Talia.
"Where's the captain? And Caspian?" "Something happened to the captain. The commander went after her."
She hesitated.
"What is it?"
Talia exhaled.
"The team the captain took with her didn't make it. I'm sorry."
Zax was speechless for a moment.
"Wait, the whole team? Lieutenant Uma? Carson?"
Talia shook her head.
"Was it this bear thing?" "Something else. The commander is investigating, but we need to get this place fortified. They were telling me how once those bears found their camp, they never stopped attacking. I think we should douse all the lights and go into stealth as much as possible." "But we have weapons. Can't we just—" "Wave 1 had weapons too," Talia snapped. "I watched 4 people shoot one of these things, and it didn't blink. Our weapons do nothing against them. If we had power, we could create a compound force barrier, but—"
She shrugged.
"And there's no chance of getting it back online?"
Her thoughts returned to Zal, slowly dying in the shuttle not more than 50 meters away.
"I don't know. We're supposed to sit tight until the commander returns. Hopefully he'll have Captain Diazol with him."
Zax nodded.
"Tell everyone from Wave 1 to form a line over by my shuttle. I need to check them over, make sure there aren't serious injuries. I'm sure they're all exhausted." "Yeah, everyone's kinda on edge."
She gave Zax a sheepish look.
"Sorry about snapping. I'm not meant to be in command." "Looks like you did a pretty good job to me. You got all these people back safe."
She smiled.
"Yeah, I guess."
A blood-curdling scream pierced the air. Over Talia's shoulders, Zax saw a massive hulking black form emerge from the woods and wrap its jaws around one of the security officers guarding the edge of the camp.
"Shit!"
Talia yelled.
"I should have fucking known. No wonder they didn't attack the whole way back. They were waiting for us to lead them to our camp."
She ran off toward the munitions shuttle, while the camp erupted into panic. Zax began herding as many people as she could toward the medical shuttle. She should be able to close the shuttle doors manually once people were safe inside.
"This way,"
Zax yelled, waving all 4 of her arms.
"Come on, over here."
A bunch of the crew ran in her direction, while others took up firing positions against the bear, taking shots at his head, body, and legs. But as Talia had said, none of the shots seemed to affect it. Zax saw Forshan grab a pulse grenade and launch it at the bear. It exploded, knocking the creature off its feet, but it righted itself immediately and began running for Forshan. Zax was mesmerized by just how fast such a large creature was. Before she could even yell out, the bear swiped at Forshan with a claw the size of a human torso. Forshan's blood painted the nearby shrubbery. He fell in a gurgling mess, and Zax understood what Riley meant when he said they didn't last long once injured. Suppressing her desire to run to Forshan anyway, Zax continued to herd people in the camp toward her shuttle when she saw a second hulking figure emerge from the jungle. Her heart dropped. One they might be able to avoid, but two?
"Get those people inside,"
Talia yelled, running past with a rifle in her hands. She turned, firing at the creatures, then resumed running. She was drawing their attention. In fact, it seemed like that's what all the security officers are doing. They knew they couldn't beat these things, but they were doing their best to keep them occupied. Zax continued to usher people inside. It would be cramped, but they could make it. She peered into the crowd of people now filling the cargo area of the small shuttle.
"Riley! Someone grab Riley!" "I'm here,"
he called back, his hand up as he moved through the throng.
"Keep these people safe," Zax said, "and take care of Zal. I'm going to try to get the rest of the crew to a second shuttle."
"Are you sure?"
"We can make room for a few more."
The crew moved back, as if to prove the point.
"It isn't enough room," she replied. "Someone would get left out. I need to help them all. We can't leave anyone behind."
She pointed to the flashing beams of pulse rifles lighting up the darkened camp as the Coalition's best security fought off two monsters the size of small shuttles. Riley nodded.
"Stay in here until we come and get you," she said,
grabbing the shuttle door and drawing it down.
"I'll do as much as I can."
"Thank you," Riley said. Some of the others expressed their appreciation as well. Zax nodded, then helped pull the shuttle door down until it was flush against the opening. She wasn't sure if the claws on those creatures could cut through pure galvanium, but she had done all she could. Zax ran over to the command shuttle, no longer bothering with her dress. Despite the shuttle being on its side, it had one of the strongest hulls, and it was big enough to hold everyone. It was just a matter of getting them inside, and the door closed. Something exploded above her head, causing her to fall to the ground, crawling along as dirt and debris erupted around her. Zax covered her head, feeling the rumble of the ground as one of the creatures came roaring toward her. This was it. Her entire life reduced to this one last moment on an unknown planet in unexplored space. She supposed it could be worse. She just hoped it was fast. The rumbling stopped while the gunshots didn't. She glanced up to see bits of hair flying off the creature as it was shot by Talia and the others from behind. But it had stopped short of attacking Zax. It sniffed the air around her once, then turned, resuming its attack toward the rest of the crew.
"What the hell?"
She scrambled up, grabbing whatever she could with two hands, while pushing up with the other two. Whatever it took to get on her feet faster. She ran for the shuttle as fast as she could, climbing into the side. Half the crates still hadn't been moved, while some had fallen from the floor and smashed open on the wall. Inside one were Aphelion oranges. Zax glanced back to the security forces, trying to fend off the bears, but having little luck. At best, they were prolonging the situation. Eventually, they'd tire, make a mistake, and the bears would have them. But the bear hadn't attacked her. Why not? Was it something about how she smelled? Or something else? Zax needed to test a hypothesis. And even though she hated them, she could use the oranges to do it. She grabbed one and tore it apart, ingesting it as fast as she could. Never in her life had she needed to eat so fast, but having such a small mouth made such tasks difficult. Finally, she got about half of it down, and she could already feel the additional oil on her skin. It would have to do. She jumped out of the shuttle and ran as fast as she could toward Talia.
"Doc? What are you doing? Get out of here!"
she yelled, waving her away as she took another few shots at the bear. One of the other personnel threw another pulse grenade at it, and it stuck in the animal's fur. It detonated, knocking the creature about 10 meters to the left. But it had just pissed the animal off. The second bear came up behind the security officer, smashing her head in its massive jaws.
"Quick," Zax said. "Come here."
She pulled Talia into a hug, rubbing all four arms all over her sides and back as she undulated against her.
"Dr. Zax? What the hell?"
"Shush," Zax said, stepping back.
"Hide behind those trees, now." "But Don't argue. I'm testing a hypothesis.
Talia took another look at the creatures regrouping, and Zax could see the internal battle in her mind. Stay and fight, or follow a superior officer's orders. She winced, then ran behind one of the larger trees. Zax nodded, running over to crewman Leaf, performing the same hugging action. She gave him the same orders, which he seemed more than happy to follow, hiding behind another tree. The bear approached just as he ran out of sight, sniffing the air. It reared up, sniffing again, but Zax held her ground, watching its massive body. Behind it, the other security officers continued to fire on the other bear.
Come on, Zax whispered. They're not here.
As if it heard her, the bear turned back toward the others, then rejoined the fight against them. Talia came up behind Zax.
I don't understand. I think they're just targeting humans, Zax said. They seem uninterested in me. So my plan is to make you smell like me. If you're out of sight, they won't find you. You two get to the shuttle. I'll go help the others. And get me more of those oranges.
What about the rest of the crew? Talia asked, looking around.
Secure in the medical shuttle. Are you sure about that?
Zax eyed the bears again.
I guess we'll find out.
29. Dagna sat immobile, reading the data from the stone screen. She had absorbed everything the Athru had on the humans, and yet something felt off. Even though she had a deep hatred for the inferior species, she felt like she had missed something. But she hadn't. Everything made sense. Their entire history, the plan to exterminate them, and how the Athru found them after thousands of years of searching. Though there had to be more to this, didn't there? It couldn't be this simple. No, that was the other one thinking for her, the human within her, Evelyn. She would not allow her to regain control, despite the surprising strength she'd shown so far. She was far more resilient than Dagna had expected. From what she knew of humans, they quit when things got too hard, or looked for the easy way out. The easiest thing for Evelyn would be to succumb to the oblivion, as Dagna had for over 30 years. There had been times when she thought she'd never be free, that she'd be stuck as a stupid human wretch for her entire existence. Once Evelyn had considered finding herself a familiar. Little did she know she already had one in the back of her mind. Rockron admitted to her he didn't know how she was possible, and that the presence of two personalities indicated she must have been engineered so her Athru nature would be completely suppressed. If so, the engineer could only have been another Athru, as they alone possessed the technology to accomplish such a feat. All signs pointed to her mother, whom she knew by name only, Esturva. It was a name built into the genetic coding of her chromosomes, like a name carved into the tablets before her. But if Esturva had engineered her child to suppress her Athru nature, it meant she had plenty of time to do it. And Evelyn's memories suggested her conception and later birth within an escape pod wasn't necessarily the true story.
Finished?
Rockron asked, coming up behind her.
I am. And I am ready to kill some humans.
Dagna stood, drawing up to her full height. She hated the shortness of this form. Another weakness.
I am glad to hear it. I have already sent the Carnivacs ahead to deal the initial blow. But there should be plenty of bodies left for us to eviscerate. The second camp is only 6 kilometers away.
He walked over and placed his hand to the stone. It stopped glowing immediately.
The Carnivacs? How do you control them? The same way you control anything without a soul. You synthesize a bionic implant in their brain and send them instructions. It's simple, old technology.
Something deep inside her found that to be repulsive, but she couldn't be sure why. Her human stomach turned. Why would using animals as weapons bother her? They were inferior species. Nothing to consider. They weren't Athru, and anything that wasn't Athru was beneath them. And in that vein, she still didn't understand how a superior Athru could mate with an ordinary human. Part of her hated her mother for that, even more than Evelyn hated her father. Dagnya smiled. It was a good thing she hadn't been out when the old human had attacked. She would have destroyed him piece by piece, leaving his pyre for the wildlings to feast upon.
Something funny?
Ragran asked, watching her face.
No, just thinking about how I'll be killing. Let us view something first. I think you'll find it interesting, Ragran replied. This way.
Dagnya stood and followed along beside him until they reached the far wall. He placed his hand on the stone, and an opening dissolved away.
I've been keeping a collection since the first of the humans landed. It is fun to draw it out, especially when I can watch them squirm. The harder their blood pumps, the further it sprays when their heads are taken from them.
They entered a large antechamber, where rows upon rows of skulls sat, stacked on shelves like books. They were of all shapes and sizes, some with bones as white as snow, others dark as ash. Many species she didn't recognize. The one stood out, a bulak, with its tiny eye slits and sloping ridge. Dagnya looked around, until she found a shelf near the bottom with fresher skulls. These still had their skin, hair, eyes, all of it, and they were all human.
My memories recognize these people, Dagnya said. Vostokov, Carson, Williams, Uma, their monikers.
Beneath each of the heads was a small pool of blood that had dripped down to the floor. Each of their eyes were still open, as if in surprise. The human stomach turned again, and Dagnya had to look away. Otherwise, the frail body would fail her.
What's the matter? This body. It isn't suited for this, Dagnya said. Isn't suited for looking? I thought you would enjoy this.
He approached her.
I do. It's just, I'm not sure this form has the constitution to deal with such things.
That's all it was. The softness was weak, and therefore not equipped to handle seeing such rampant death. It was nothing more.
I see. Perhaps we should perform another examination, Ragran said. I wouldn't want it to fail you on the battlefield.
Dagnya shook her head.
I'll be fine.
Though she could taste bile at the back of her throat.
I need a weapon.
Ragran seemed confused a moment.
Yes, of course. Your bare hands are much too frail to do any real damage. Once this is all over, and we have rejoined the fleet, we will need to make some enhancements.
What sort of enhancements? She tried not to look at the skulls again, but it seemed almost as if they were staring at her, accusing her.
We'll remove some of the human junk from your genetic code. It should allow your true heritage to assert itself. No longer will you be trapped. Either that, or we'll remove you completely.
Dagnya liked the sound of that. But deep within, some part of her rebelled, seething at the thought. She needed a distraction, something to keep her mind off whatever was happening back there.
I do not want to waste any more time. Let's begin the killing.
Ragran smiled.
Yes, let's begin.
Do you think I should call for her? Box asked as they walked along the dark passageway. He'd activated the halogen in his remaining eye, while Cas and Jan had turned on their own lights, as it was pitch black inside. The corridor was stone on all sides, and the air inside was stale, as if it hadn't been used in a very long time. Do that, and you'll give away our position, Marshall said, walking beside them. They'd had no choice but to go into the pyramid after Laura had disappeared. Cas knew he should have kept a better eye on her, that she was too anxious to find Evie. He couldn't blame her, but he also didn't want to walk into a trap. He was just glad he had his gun with him for once, because after just appearing from out of nowhere, he really didn't trust his former bartender. You said you'd tell us what's going on, So talk. Cas glared at Marshall. Marshall sighed. My primary purpose has always been to monitor the captain. She doesn't know it, but I've been watching her most of her life. Why? Cas asked. Monitor for what? It's hard to explain. For signs of disruption. Cas laughed, shaking his head. You know, back there when I agreed not to shoot you, that was because you promised me answers. And yet here you are giving us cryptic half-truths. And I have to tell you, my trigger finger is starting to get really itchy. Marshall indicated they take the left corridor. You don't want that, Box replied. One time, when he was really drunk, he complained I wouldn't shut up about my then newest obsession, As the Station Turns. It was a quaint little tale of two families, Erustian and human, involved in a bitter, centuries-old feud. The main character was Box, Cas snapped. The point is, he shot me in the ass one night. Right here. Box pointed to the rear plate where his lanky leg connected to his torso. Blew the cover right off, exposing me. Can you believe that? Exposing me. And all because I was excited about a new show. So I can guarantee, if he doesn't like what he hears, he'll shoot you in the ass too. Thank you for the rousing cry of support, Cas grimaced. You're very welcome, Box replied. Just tell us what's going on, old man, Jan said, startling Cas. She'd been silent since they'd entered the pyramid. Marshall stopped walking. I wish I could say more, but I am bound by my oath. Here's what I can tell you. There is a creature somewhere in this structure that is not native to this world, but knows how to use its technology. It is a creature known as an Athru, what you call Andromeda. I believe it has taken the captain, and I fear its reasoning, though I don't know its methods. It is a very dangerous creature, as you've seen. So we must find the lieutenant and the captain before either one of them are irreversibly injured. What does that mean, irreversibly? Cas asked. It means what the Athru intend to do to the captain may have long-term consequences from which he might not be able to recover. I only hope we're not too late. Time is different in this place. Can you feel it? It's still, like the hands on the clock that have been frozen. How do you know all this? Cas asked. Marshall sucked his lips between his teeth, setting his gaze. This is not my first visit to this planet. But when I saw it last, it was much different. Much, much different. Time has changed this place. How could you have been to this planet before? We are years from Coalition space. Cas stared the man down. As far as he knew, no human had ever been out this far before. At least the exploratory missions that had left for this region of space had never returned. Had Marshall been on one of those missions? And why didn't you warn us about the dampening field? Jan asked. I didn't know about it. When I was here last, it didn't exist, he said. But I figure the time dilation did. Is that why you boarded the second wave of shuttles? Cas asked. Marshall turned and continued walking, Box providing the light for the way. I took the second wave to keep an eye on the captain. I knew if I took one of the others, I might have been out of contact for weeks, or maybe even years. You could have warned us, Jan said, anger in her voice. We have good people who've died because you decided not to tell us they'd be stranded here for weeks at a time. And these bear things. How were we supposed to defend ourselves against those? Again, Marshall said, those didn't exist the last time I was here. It's been a very long time. You're not making any sense, Cas said. And frankly, I'm getting tired of it. Box, are you making a mental map of this place? You know me, boss, always on the ball. Yes or no? Yes. From here on out. Cas sighed. Good enough. 'Cause I'm still not sure he's not trying to get us trapped down here. How do we even know we're following Laura? We don't, Marshall replied. We're headed toward the center, where the captain will be if she's here. Like I said, she's my main priority. So we're just supposed to leave Laura to wander these halls forever? Jan said. Once we've determined the captain is safe, we can find her, Marshall replied. Cas exchanged a glance with Jan. She nodded. There was no way they could trust this man. If he did lead them to Evie, they needed to get some real answers out of him. But Cas didn't like what he'd said about the aliens permanently affecting her. They'd come all this way and searched this long, only to lose Evie to the very creatures they sought? If something happened to her, he would be done. And there would be no coming back from it for him either.